contents of Volume 2 and to point out that for this series on anthropogenesis, HPB postulates three further fundamental propositions. We've spoken of the three propositions that are basic to the entire Secret Doctrine. Now she gives these, and we don't have time to really examine them, but I think we should notice them, at least, take note of them, because again, they're fundamental to an understanding of anthropogenesis. The first deals with the simultaneous evolution, she speaks of it, the simultaneous evolution of 7 human groups on 7 different portions of our globe. A full examination of that would, of course, require much more time than we have right now. But in one sense, and in one sense only, and I'm oversimplifying, so please keep that in mind, it deals with the suggestion, at least, the fact that all of these 7 principles are already in us, or that is, the possibility of their unfoldment is present, so that it is simultaneously present throughout the world, the earth, in terms of the fact that there is an exact correspondence between man's physical development, man's physical development and the condition of the planet on which he resides. So I merely throw that out. These are all hints. What we're doing is an overview, remember. And so these are hints for deeper study, for things that could be gone into. And this is one of the fascinating aspects, is that there is a correspondence between the physical development of the human being and the earth, or the locale in which he resides, the condition of the earth on which, or the planet on which he resides. The second is, of course, the birth, she says, of the astral before the physical. Now, when she uses the word astral, we have to keep in mind that it is different from its use in the later literature, and is indeed referring to that principle which we've designated the linga sharira. That is, it is the model body. So that the model is always given before its densification. And I think this is certainly very clearly understood. Most startling of all is one that I've already referred to, that man in this particular cycle, which is called a round, and again, we don't have time to explore in detail the subject of the rounds, the planetary chains and the rounds, the cycles that take place within the scheme of the whole evolutionary pattern. But that for this particular period, man preceded every mammalian in the animal kingdom. A remarkable statement, which again, we haven't time to explore, but I throw it out because these are the 3 propositions that have to be looked at and have to be dealt with to understand the esoteric philosophy in regard to anthropogenesis. I'm not going to deal with them, but merely throw them out at this point. But before we take up the study of the stages of development, which is the third area I have put on the board, there are some concepts, some preliminaries that I would like to call your attention to. First of all, I think I've already mentioned that the stanzas, or the verses, or shlokas, if you prefer the technical term, the shlokas, which are given in Volume 2, are given in a different order. They're given in a different form from those which were given and gave us the description of the cosmogonic process in Volume 1. It's evident, very evident, for example, that what we've been given in Volume 2 of the Secret Doctrine is far more incomplete than were the earlier stanzas. In fact, HPB herself states that only 49 shlokas out of several hundred are here given. Oh, that's an amazing statement. Only 49 out of several hundred. So we have to assume that there is a reason why 49. She continues by saying, not every verse is translated verbatim. A periphrasis is sometimes used for the sake of clearness and intelligibility, where a literal translation would be quite unintelligible. So she has given us an indication, I think, and I merely propose this to you, a clue that there was a purpose in giving 49. She separated them into 12 sections and called them stanzas, 12 stanzas. But I think the important thing is that she has numbered these shlokas or verses consecutively, 1 to 49, so that there must therefore be some reason, it seems to me. And it seems to me that this has to do with the nature of man himself, that each of these principles in effect stands for 7 operating functional aspects. And therefore, there are what are known as the 49 fires. This is made very clear, I might say, for those of you who'd like to pursue it further, in Geoffrey Barborka's book, The Peopling of the Earth, the 49 fires, as they are spoken of. Ashish, in his commentary in Man, Son of Man, points out that although the significance of this second set of shlokas is essentially the same as that of the first, the relatively homogeneous symbolic exegesis of the first set has given way to a mixture of mythology, allegory, and anthropology. And so we have to begin to separate this and begin to see, I think, as I've already said, that it deals less with historical events, or at least with events that can be historically verified, but in their reference to ourselves as what is human, the psychological development, that the real significance, therefore, lies in the symbolic account of the movements of consciousness within us, not in their concern with historical, geological, or anthropological events. And therefore, I treat them, and feel that they should be treated, as the mythological account of growth of consciousness. That they are a guide to our true nature, and not, therefore, to the history of external evolution or the surface of our planet. But they really show us our origins and our way of return through the flowering of all of our potential, which is present because the principles are within us. And of course, our physical evolution does form part of the story. And so, naturally, there are references. And it's interesting that today, the contemporary theories of evolution are more closely approximating, at least it seems to me, more closely approximating many of the statements made by HBB. But what is important is that all of this is still present within us. I think this we have to keep in mind, that everything is still present. Perhaps there's another way to put it. All of the early stages of our own development, from infancy to whatever our present age may be, adulthood, we're all adults here, at least, even though of different ages, all of those stages are still present within us. This, of course, is a psychological fact, isn't it? And may have a very direct bearing on, indeed, how we act today. What is our behavior today? I'm not thinking of it in simply the Freudian sense, although certainly there is some validity even in the Freudian sense of events of our very early childhood, of our infancy, which may be forgotten, but which marked us in many, many ways. But also in the Jungian and a sense, I happen to be much more of a Jungian than a Freudian, certainly these early stages of consciousness are still somehow present, and they have directed us, and they have marked the further development of consciousness. In the terms of the Secret Doctrine, in the terms of anthropogenesis, these stages of development are referred to as root races. Unfortunately, I think a very a term that lacks the full meaning and has led to much, much misunderstanding. It is not a term that was invented by HPB, however. It appears to have been a term that was used first by A.P. Sinnott, and one finds it in the letters from the Mahatmas to Mr. Sinnott, the very fact that this is a term that the masters accepted. Use it if you wish. In one of the famous letters to Mr. Sinnott, one of the masters writes, let us agree upon terminology. Let us agree to what we're going to call these concepts. And makes the statement, our terms are nearly untranslatable. So we have to remember something I emphasized on our very first morning together, and that is that the presentation of this tradition was given in what we may call the vernacular, the English language as a vernacular, for the first time outside of the mystery schools, where another language has to be learned, where indeed a philosophic language, perhaps like Sanskrit or Tibetan. Tibetan is, like Sanskrit, is a deeply philosophical language. English is not. English is a language of commerce and trade, as it's often put, you see. And we don't have, for example, I referred earlier to the word self. That self can refer to different levels. And so we often qualify our words, don't we? The essential self, the egoic self, the personal self, and so on. But the word self, we find this, for example, with the word love. There is no more abused word, I think, in the English language than the word love. And yet, in the Greek, there were 3 words that described levels of love, or qualities or capacities that are functions of love. And so we have to recognize that there was this problem at the very outset, and that was, how do you translate terms that are either in the Tibetan or the Sanskrit? Sanskrit is a highly philosophic language, into English. And so the master was very clear on this. Our terms are nearly untranslatable. And it appears to have been Sinnott, so far as I can make out, who first used the term root race, or race. And to distinguish these major developmental stages, used the term root, which seems a perfectly legitimate term. And the term race in the last century was not pejorative in the same way it has become in our time. You see, and immediately it came to be assumed that we were talking about ethnic groups. And this is very clearly not what is referred to, but major developmental stages. Mr. Barborka, for example, made this very clear in much of his writing on this. These are major developmental stages. And today, in contemporary psychology, we are acquainted with developmental stages. In educational psychology, for example, the work of Piaget has given rise to an understanding that there are developmental stages in the student, in the young person. This is very much being focused on in a variety of psychologies, not only Jungian, but in many other, the Rogerian psychology, transpersonal psychology, humanistic psychology, and so on. And even educators such as Lawrence Kohlberg, the late Lawrence Kohlberg of Harvard, that there are moral stages of development, that these are not necessarily equated with a particular age, but that there are stages of moral development, and so on. So if we can see that what we're talking about when we say root races are stages of development of consciousness, then we can say that in the terminology of the Secret Doctrine, the first, second, third, and fourth races, or stages, are still present within us, although we are in the fifth developmental stage. And even in our very genetic structure, we are all that has ever been in the evolutionary scheme, biologically. And we know that in the prenatal life, within the early stages of the embryo and its development, we recapitulate the earlier stages of evolutionary development. So in our very genetic structure, we carry this. And there are studies now that indicates that there is but one genetic pool in the whole universe. There is one genetic pool, and we're all variations from that genetic pool. So there you are. Even at the biological level, we are brothers. We are indeed unified. There is a unity. And certainly at the highest level, if you want to use high and low, as this is always very interesting, somehow we picture spirit as high and matter as low. Metaphorically, this is a direction which is not meaningless, isn't it, you see? But if you want to say at the very deepest level of ourselves, the very inmost level of our being, we are also one, as we are at the outermost, the biological level, we are one. But therefore, all of these earlier stages are present in our psychological structure. Consciousness is composed of strands from those earlier stages of development. And one day, and this I think is the main point that is also emphasized, that to realize consciously our full potential, we will have to face and deal with, which means become self-conscious of, those psychological aspects of our being that we've inherited from our own past. It's a staggering challenge, but I think it places in perspective our present stage of development with all its attendant problems and opportunities. So that all of this is now present within us. And we have to begin to recognize that we have to one day deal with all of these aspects. Well, what are these stages of development then? I thought I would turn, and you can see I've turned a great number of pages, to perhaps one of the easiest ways to summarize them. And that is by turning to one of the shlokas in this series of 49 shlokas. To just give you, first of all, the flavor of one of the shlokas, the difficulty of dealing with it, perhaps, but also to point out a kind of recapitulation. This is shloka number 39 of volume 2. It's on page 227 in volume 2. And speaking, therefore, of these stages of development, which, as I say, are called root races, the shloka reads, "The first on every zone was moon-colored, the second yellow like gold, the third red, the fourth brown, which became black with sin. The first 7 shoots were all of one complexion in the beginning. The next 7 began mixing their colors. Now, that doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? Until we begin to really look at it from, I suggest, both the developmental point of view from the triple evolutionary scheme, but also even more from the psychological scheme. Because here there is an order represented by colors. And while we may remember that different traditions assign different symbolic meanings or values to the various colors, we can see a clear movement, if you like, towards materialization or densification in this elaboration of the first, second, third, fourth, and so on. So we may note that at the outset, the 7 shoots were all of one complexion. That is to say, there was only the non-colored origination of Atman, which is no color, which is no color at all, and therefore of one complexion, because all human stock is rooted in that primordial field Atman, if you like. One of the interesting things, I think, to note is that the word for color, or is often translated as color, in the Sanskrit is varna, V-A-R-N-A. But it also stands for figure, shape, outward appearance, covering external form, nature, quality, and so on. A wide variety of meanings which are attached to a term which HPB here simply translates as color. But it has to do with shape, form, appearance, and so on. And so the list of the races, or the colored races, represents the objective coverings, the spatial qualities, which make manifest the archetypal pattern externalizing through each quality-less spark on the different levels of the manifest universe. And the quality-less spark is of one color, you see, that is, which is no color. So we can begin to look at these, I think. It becomes logical to assign moon-colored to the first root race. And here we can begin then to recognize that we are dealing first of all with the physical evolution. And what is given to us is that a form must first be prepared in order for the mind, manas, to become activated. The principle is there. Remember, the principles are there from the beginning. But now, for our particular cycle, a form is necessary. And so we have the first root race, if you like, the first developmental stage, which is moon-colored. And that's interesting from a variety of points of view. First of all, because the teaching is that the stages preceding this particular cycle were within a cycle that was, of which the moon was the central or fourth planet, as it were, not our particular satellite, but therefore called a lunar cycle, as we are called the Earth cycle. I'm not going to get into that. I'll just throw it out. You have to look at it yourself. The word Chandra in Sanskrit, which is moon, literally means glittering. So it has to do with this very glittering, almost pure being, which is not yet in physical form, and therefore the Linga Sharira, the model body, It also refers to the fact that the moon, in that sense, was our parent. The lunar scheme, I'm not going to go into that, but one of the points is that with every developmental stage, a sense is developed, and the sense associated with this is sound. Sound. Which is quite logical because the vibratory beginnings produce, as it were, sound. Notice that it's not the organ of hearing, the ear, but rather it is the reception, which is an overall reception of sound. The second, according to this, remember, the second stage, second race, is yellow, like gold. And that gives a greater stability, now begins to have a greater form, a hardening of form. And so to sound is added touch. And that, of course, is quite natural because as form hardens, one begins to touch a variety of things. And these, of course, refer to the physical evolution. These are very definitely within the physical. Now the third stage is known as red. And now we have, with the stabilization of form, the meeting of others, the movement that enables us to meet, and what arises? Pleasure, pain, we like some, we don't like others. And so it is desire, the awakening of kama. And it's interesting to note the sense that is now developed with this. It is sound in the first, sound and touch, now sound, touch, and color, which refers to the differentiation which sight brings. And HPB uses these terms. She doesn't say hearing, touching, and seeing. She uses these, as she speaks of the senses, as sound and touch and color. Color begins to differentiate. The world is no longer just gray, you see, as it's been. Now we begin to bump into each other, bump into objects, bump into each other, and so become red with desire. Our attention is turned outwards. And desire results in motion. And now we're swept into an action. We're swept away into action. And it is at the midpoint, then, of this developmental stage that there is awakened, then, the mind. This is one of the great subjects of the whole Secret Doctrine, the awakening of the mind with the incarnation, actually, in this nascent form of a class of beings who have reached this stage, who have developed this before, now take over for further advance. A great subject. And if you would like to really look at it more deeply, there's a wonderful little book by one of our great scholars of the Secret Doctrine, Adam Walker. And don't worry, called An Inquiry into the Nature of Mind. And I definitely refer you to it if you would like to really to discover what happened at this midpoint of this third developmental stage, because it is a great story, a wonderfully exciting story. But it brings about a lot of problems. You know, the mind can solve many issues and then get us also into problems. So this is what happened. And consequently, the fourth stage, now with the intellectual development, you see, really in full swing, brown, black. Which is the densest point also, the densest point, if you like, attention really turned outward, a kind of final plunge, not only into physical embodiment, but now really stable, in a stable physical form, as it were, and now with the mind fully developed, not fully developed, but the mind really activated. And now, the very fact that the shloka says, brown with black, becoming black with sin, indicates that there is a moral awakening, a conscience awakening. With mind activated, we become aware of moral judgments. And the interesting thing, the sense equated with this is taste. This may remind you of the biblical story, you see, which again, great symbology, great myth, that our humanity, represented by Adam and Eve, were not to taste of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You see. To taste of the fruit, you see. Tasting. Because there, and it's interesting that there is this emphasis, therefore, on the sense of taste, that with this full plunge, as it were, into physical embodiment, this full movement outwards, there comes then this awareness. We want to taste the world. We want to, and in many of the great myths, there's an eating of the world. There's an eating of fruit that's forbidden, or there's an eating of the world, or there's an eating of something, you see. The tasting, because only it's representative of, symbolic of, this deeper sense of awareness of choice within us. And I think it's interesting, the different flavors we begin to distinguish. Is something sweet or sour? Is something bitter or sweet, and so on, you see. So there comes a greater distinction, a polarity of the opposites, very much. And then the movement, which is only hinted at, the fifth, which begins a real mixture, because now clearly in the whole intellectual development, clearly here, and we have there the mixture, because it's all present within us. And the sense that is developed, interestingly, is smell. Sense of smell, HPB says. And it's, I think, extremely interesting. It's the point of interaction between the physical and these other subtle levels, entire range of the subtle worlds. And when I say smell, I'm always reminded of a statement in the Mahatma letters in which one of the masters, speaking of some individual, I've forgotten whom, Virginia may remember, but some individual, there is a moral smell as well as a physical one. And so there comes again a clearer differentiation. And yet it's interesting how closely these two senses are related. As you know, if you ever have a very bad cold, what happens? Your nose is stuffed up, for example. You can't smell, and then you can't taste. They're very much intertwined, aren't they, these two senses, taste and smell. And yet, basically, we are able, by and large, to differentiate taste better than we are to differentiate smell. And this is psychologically shown. There's many psychological tests. But quite obviously, there have to be the sixth and seventh developmental stages yet to come. Very little is said about these stages, practically nothing, other than the fact that at one point HPB says that the sixth has more to do with psychology than with physics. She also makes other statements that are equally provocative, that the sixth sense may have to do with permeability rather than, certainly we're not talking about extrasensory perception, clairvoyance, or any of those things, but rather with a universe, the development of a sense which is a faculty not beyond the physical, but expresses through the physical. And so it seems to me, at this point, however, from the fifth onwards, we have to break away from our traditional habit of thinking in terms of linear progress. Our potentiality for evolutionary growth is now in a vertical or spiritual dimension, which has been really an active component in human history ever since, as Ashish puts it, the divine intelligence first shone out through the bright focus of the human mind. What is now required for the sixth and seventh, the remainder of the fifth, is a turning about in the seat of consciousness, as the Buddhists put it. And that turning about will probably constitute the sixth stage. Not in linear terms, but a new leap in consciousness. And that is the possibility. So this, we begin to see why you need to understand the principles, why the triple evolutionary scheme has its importance, and the developmental stages, which are here spoken of as root races, and you begin to see that this is indeed the most marvelous myth because it's the story of our own being in the world.